I'm going to welcome up here April Anson and Alex Minrinsky. I'll give a very brief introduction because I expect most of you know something of their work already. Alex, most recently, I think I have it in my backpack, is the author of Everyday Ecofascism, Crisis and Consumption in American Literature from University of Minnesota Press. It came out earlier this year. I highly recommend it. He is an associate professor at University of Connecticut in the English department. April is working on a book also with ecofascism as part of its title, Unfenceable.
Oh, tentatively titled.
Just
leave it.
Tentatively titled Unfenceable, American Ecofascism, Literary Genre, and Indigenous Environmental Justice. She was also the co-author of Peace and Boundary 2 with Anadita Banerjee, who we had hoped would be here as well, but had a conflict. That piece I also recommend, Green Walls, Everyday Ecofascism, and the Politics of Proximity. She also is at University of Connecticut in the English department, and together I recommend this if you have not already seen it. They are part of the Anti-Creep Climate Collective and have authored a webzine, the Against Ecofascism CREEP webzine, that is particularly targeted at debunking eco-fascist myths for students. And it's a really fun and interesting public humanities project that I definitely recommend you check out, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about that today. If you're ready, we'll go ahead and launch in. I'm sure that both of you are already somewhat tired of this line of questioning, but I think it's where we need to begin, even if hopefully we can move through it with some degree of speed. And I'm going to not ask, at least initially, about the category of everyday ecofascism, but start from fascism. Right? And I think one of the powerful things that I experienced about your work was that it has an account of fascism that is perhaps unfamiliar in the ways that fascism has become a kind of saturating term of the present. And particularly, we see a lot of definitions of fascism around authoritarianism, policing, the repression of speech, and almost always with the emphasis on a kind of top-down definition. And one of the things that your work emphasizes is a kind of accretion of fascism that allows us then to think about it as something that is very closely associated with aesthetics, with popular forms, with genre. And so I thought I would start there, right? Why is it important to think about fascism as a politics that has a grassroots origin, even if it often manifests in forms of plenipotentiary power?
I feel like you should take this one to start. Out of the grace of.
Why is it important to think about it that way? So I think, you had mentioned maybe getting to the category of everyday later, but I think the reason it's important to think of it that way is that all fascism historically was everyday. Mm-hmm. And this kind of misconception of it, popular misconception of it, has been that it is sort of like a top-down kind of thing. And I think about, in terms of why it's important, I'm thinking, like, what does that word do for us? There's been plenty of commentary recently that the word has lost its power and its significance because it is so it is genuinely overused, or it is misused because it's misunderstood, because fascism is a legitimately challenging concept. But I think that is why it's important, is because it means something very particular, and it's the particular thing that most popular understandings of it miss. And that particular thing is that fascism looks like manifestations of fascism look like far-right extremism, whether institutionalized or not. But it's not. And that's what makes the concept unique and useful, is that it is not an ideology properly conceived. It is not limited to the far right. If you look at comparative fascist studies as a field, it kind of ends up being about, like, there are kind of, for me, two big lessons that are taken away, that you can take away from that field of study. The first is that it's a field of study that kind of looks at two different things, and people who work in comparative fascist studies have a lot of angry things to say about the people working on the other side of it. And there are all these little internecine conflicts, but at the end of the day, they're looking at two different things that are related. And one of them is what fascism ultimately, quote unquote, looks like. What is the manifestation? What is fascism proper? And of course, that's what we all think of when we think of fascism. We think of death camps. We think of the SS. You know, we think of these very kind of like, it's taken hold, it's in the streets, and people are dying. So what does it ultimately look like? But the other kind of vein of comparative fascist studies is interested in how does it happen? How does it come about? How does it get there? And fascism is distinct because it's not top-down. The few fascist regimes that have legitimately took power democratically. And then the second important takeaway is that historically, fascist movements and regimes were not popular just on the far right, they were popular across the political spectrum. People left, right, and center were really into fascist movements, and they were really into fascist regimes when they took power. And that is because, as the late historian George Moss puts it, fascism isn't an ideology, it's a scavenger. It's not like conservatism or liberalism. It doesn't have a theory. It instead is sort of like it's like cherry picking existing nonpartisan cultural narratives and remixing them in new ways that come to make extreme identitarian violence appear not just attractive but also necessary. And that's why it gets so popular, is because it's working with kind of nonpartisan cultural narratives, these kind of storytelling traditions that are deeply ingrained in a society. So that if we're talking about it, I think of it like a genre, right? And to a certain extent, all political phenomena, ideologies or otherwise, can be understood in terms of genre, in terms of storytelling conventions. But the thing I think that's important about it is, like, there is sort of like what does it look like? It looks like that kind of like that genre, and it can look like that in a lot of different places around the globe. But the actual cast of characters changes because every nation has its own preoccupations, its own traditions, its own storytelling, conventions, and so what's populating that genre is going to be different from place to place. To kind of go back to how I began, I think that's why it's important, is because people hear fascism and they think, oh, it's a far-right ideology, it's a far-right movement. But that's not the case historically, and as a heuristic, the idea of fascism is useful, particularly because it's this unique thing where it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but it's not far-right ideology. It's something that people across the political spectrum are interested in and supporting, whether they know they're doing it or not.
So in full transparency, I'm not a fascist studies scholar, and I even come to ecofascism through a little bit of a backdoor that I've been studying for a very long time, the relationship between white supremacy and climate change, the way it shows up in our narratives, and it wasn't until after I had defended my dissertation that Christchurch happened. And I thought, I've been talking about ecofascism this whole time. So,
you should add, right, that the Christchurch shooter used the word to describe himself.
Yes, sorry, thank you. I'm assuming some common knowledge here. But that, the Christchurch mass murderer was the first time that term kind of became legible in popular media. And so I think my approach and my engagement with fascist studies and comparative fascist studies is one of learning. I'm not pretending to intervene in those fields. And as Alex and I's work, I think, is really dedicated to, COVID showed us all how everyday these logics can be. And I'm from Eugene, Oregon, which is kind of hippie epicenter culturally. And so, when COVID hit, my social media feeds were flooded with what I think I would have assumed very liberal identified or lefty identified people sharing really troublesome memes and sentiments that felt, kind of ripped. Some of it ripped straight from Frederick Jackson Turner's descriptions. Some of it ripped right from Emerson's denial of, any sort of historicity to the land. And so I think all that to say is that when I approach, my approach to fascist studies is less from a desire to intervene in those fields and more a desire to kind of broaden the scope beyond far right, beyond the governmental structures, and more this kind of common sense, right? What makes it possible that these folks in my life, and when I'm under-resourced myself, right? Where does that misanthropy come from, and why does it just slide so frictionlessly into my consciousness and to my environmental politics? So I think that's where a lot of the work that Alex and I have done together has come from. And it does feel as though it has a lot to offer fascist studies, primarily because we know that environmental appeals are kind of the fastest pipeline to move people into far-right ideologies.
Yeah. Whether that has to do with energy,
right? Whether
resources,
it's energy, yeah.
or it's
immigration,
quote-unquote healthy organic eating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all these appeals, I think, are they're the things that don't look like a duck, but they really, really quack like a duck, right? We don't recognize the call, I think, because it is a kind of common sense that's built into not just far-right American politics, but like capital L liberalism, right? It is based on claims about the environment.
And Turner's ideas about exceptionalism and Emerson's ideas about universality on the land, like kind of like a blinkered universality on the land. Like, those are great examples because, like, why did so many liberal or leftist people say that nature was healing and humans were a plague and death was a good thing? It wasn't because they were neo-Nazis. Mm-hmm. It was, again, because of these nonpartisan, deeply ingrained elements of U.S. culture. Mm-hmm. U.S.
Yeah,
culture.
and I think that was something that surprised me, too, about when I first started reading widely in fascist studies, is that there was very little mention, save for Jack Forbes and a couple of that I know of, like Kashana Robinson, Roland Robinson, that were saying, look, the 19th century United States set the template for what we recognize as fascism in the 20th century. Obviously, it's it changes depending on.
Jack Forbes even said the Confederacy was the first true fascist state. Yep.
Well, your lead. I want to make sure we come back to talk about the popular iterations of ecofascism in our hyper-present. But your answers lead me into something that I definitely wanted to ask April in particular, which is assuming that a good many of us here at the Quarry Farm Symposium, sponsored by the Center for Mark Twain Studies, have some sort of relationship to 19th century American history and culture. I was hoping that you would sort of tease out, right, the ways in which those eco-fascist paradigms exist for you in transcendentalism, in late 19th century American literature. What, as C19 scholars, right, how does this impact our field?
Oh man, you're really putting my historicism on the spot here.
You said your name.
No,
so
yeah. I do supposedly fashion myself as a 19th centurist. No, I'm being maybe unethically self-deprecating here, but for me, I grew up always considering myself an environmentalist, a lefty environmentalist, that I thought, well, that means that I'm an Emerson stan, I'm a Thoreau stan, right? Like, I have a lineage already laid out for me. And especially as a first generation scholar, like that, for me, that performance was really important, right? And then it wasn't until one of my master's programs that I read Emerson's English Traits. And I thought, what? What? How is this the origin of American environmental thought? Supposedly, right? And then I went back and read Nature, and I thought, what? This is not a viable environmental ethic for anyone, right? So I think for me, Emerson is like kind of the boogeyman of the 19th century. But we should talk to Jeffrey, because he's obviously much more, to speak to that, I think, in much more detail. But all that to say is that reading in that kind of the story of mainstream American thought in the 19th century, I saw all of these tropes that were so recognizable to, let's say, like the deep ecology movement in 1990s, right? The save the planet, kill yourself kind of misanthropy.
Or in Thoreau's Walking, you could trace the Nature's Nation idea to that, with the idea that westward lies authenticity, like go east for stale civilization, but like vitality and authentic nature, and the people who inhabit authentic nature by necessity are west.
Yeah, which then turns into a form of environmental history that controlled like 80% of American history curriculum up until the 1980s. So, there is that through line that's pretty, I think, pretty easy to trace. And then when I went back to these people, like Turner is such a good example. The Frontier Thesis is a work of fantasy fiction. He's just telling fictitious stories, and he's calling it history, right? So I think for me, the richness of the 19th century is disabusing ourselves of the idea that this is a strain of American environmental thought one strain instead of
and
the strain.
The kind of even like more obvious kind of connection between 19th century culture, literary culture, and proto-environmentalist culture is the kind of formation of these preservationist societies in the late 19th century were populated, it was populated by folks we look back on and see as kind of towering names in literary environmentalism, not just John Muir, but others too. But most of these big names were also quite explicitly tied not just to immigration restriction movements, but also eugenics. So, Madison and Grant argued that redwoods should be preserved because they're the master race of trees, just as white, Nordic Anglo-Saxons should be preserved for the same reason. And then Theodore Roosevelt was right on board with it, and then you have Adolf Hitler saying that Madison Grant was his favorite writer, and that Jim Crow was his template for the final solution. So like there's very much like an actually very like as far as historical genealogies go, a pretty clear one. Like pretty the breadcrumbs are very very obvious.
Yeah, and I think the way that it shows up in, let's say, the last 30 years, maybe post the WTO protests, is this really intentional cultivation of a kind of pseudo-intellectual tradition on the right that's using the same, in many cases, like the exact same, the analogy of the redwoods to an endangered white race. And those are, they're very deliberate and intentional about this kind of self-reinforcing intellectual tradition. And there's very little work done on the fact that these are actually 100+ years old rhetorical moves.
I really love the work you do on it, though, this whole self-reinforcing thing. I'd like to hear you talk more about that too, because I think you have a really good way of talking about it.
Oh, I
Well, let's-
appreciate that.
yeah.
Well, okay, so I think it for me, this is a reductive genealogy, but I do think this is just a rehearsal of Locke's tautology of property. That land becomes property when we work on it, right? But land has to exist before, right? So there is a kind of, it's not just a terra nullius in terms of like colonial logics of land theft, but it's like a terra nullius of a fantasy invention origin story. And that, to me, that kind of logical template, maybe you could say, it's just the exact same when we look at someone like Curtis Yarvin, like the pseudo far right, pseudo intellectual philosopher, whatever he is.
Dark Enlightenment.
The Dark Enlightenment guy, right? It is a because I said so structure.
Yeah.
It starts from nothing and then it cites itself as fact and projects that fact into the future. So this kind of self-reinforcing logic, I'm sure we can find it many, many places, but to me, like Locke lays that template. He also is telling a fiction that was funded by, by enslavers. And that kind of funded fantasy fiction, to me, is the through line. That then materializes in, toxic atmospheric carbon count. But that might be a little too much of a jump for, materialist literary folks. I'm looking at Alex to save me from myself at this point.
I want to, I want Alex to also talk about his archive to some extent, but I want to make sure that I also engage with what both of you are doing with this work in both, public scholarship and, from what I have gathered, in the classroom. And I think the idea of fascism or ecofascism as a scavenger politics is incredibly useful to help students stop accepting a set of received ideas or received wisdom and actually analyze the narratives, the genres that they are consuming, and the potential political repercussions of those cultural forms. And so my question is, I know at least one potential answer to this question because it's part of how you structured the zine, but how do you bring pop culture, whether literary or cinematic or televisual or journalistic, into the classroom or into, I know you're both very interested as well as sort of like community activism kind of work, right? To bring popular, familiar texts through which you can start to unpack these ideas and shift the way that, the kind of received way that we think about this scavenger politics. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the zine was actually, that was really easy in many ways. We wrote it, 4 years ago at this point? It was a while ago. But it was at a time when every single one of our students in any given classroom would have seen Avengers Endgame or Avengers Infinity War. And Thanos was sort of this or eco-fascist figure, snap your fingers, wipe out half the life in the universe to save resources for the other half, excepting of course the person doing the snapping, who then goes on to live in this idyllic last green valley paradise, right? And it's that moving on to live in the idyllic last green valley paradise that is most resonant with actual real life far right arguments about population control and that stuff. But it was a really good, it was this real zeitgeist moment where we had a cartoon villain who was almost universally recognized, but where we were kind of upset about it. But also, and this was an opportunity for us too, because students were really on board with this. The moment we could say to students, the weird thing about Marvel using this guy as a villain is that people are driving around with bumper stickers on their cars, like, Thanos was right, like, there are too many people, there aren't enough resources, like, the world is on fire. And, like, parts of that are kind of hard to argue with. But we could come in and say to students, what does it say that we have these two movies, blockbuster movies, and in the first one, Thanos is raising all these arguments that are resonating with a lot of people, and then he wipes out half of the life in the galaxy, and then in the next movie, all the good guys team up to fight Thanos, and that part is completely gone. Like his motivations, like his complicated feelings about the world, and like the issues he is trying to solve, however problematically, are just completely left unsaid.
They don't defeat him in the marketplace of ideas.
But that was kind of what we thought was like, okay, so what if that was what they were doing, though? Like, what if the problem Thanos was trying to solve was still on the table? What if that wasn't wiped entirely from the second movie? And what if part of the conflict and part of the good guys fighting this guy wasn't just them beating him up, but actually, like, here's why you're wrong, like, here's all the things you're saying, and here's how we actually, we have existing solutions to these problems that don't involve murdering a bunch of people, and pointing that out, like, almost automatically got students on board, like, because they were also they were like, oh, I guess Marvel and Disney didn't address that at the end of things, and then because like a lot of the kids in the class would be the people who would drive around with a bumper sticker saying Thanos was right, so they're really interested in the fact that conversation got dropped once you pointed out to them. So that was a really easy in to the conversation with them, and from there it became about thinking about like, what is this argument? Let's kind of pick it apart into component pieces, and let's think about how he's making that argument and what alternatives exist to each of those components. And that ended up being how we structured the zine itself, with these kind of 6 myths. But it was really, that was kind of what it was. It was thinking about, we think about a character like Thanos, what are the kind of premises he's working off of? Okay, let's look at those, and then let's kind of think about them historically, right, rather than in the space of this deeply ahistorical Disney production.
And we should mention, too, the other members of the group.
Yes, we should.
Which is Shane Hall, who's at Salisbury University, Cassie Galantine at University of Oregon, and Bruno Serafin at University of Connecticut, and now Jane Henderson at Dartmouth. So just full credit where credit's due here.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that we all had some kind of rage group therapy about was that, the scholarship disproving Thanos and his very flimsy claims, but even a kind of more full realized version of Thanos has been extant for 50 years.
Yeah.
And so why do we continue to keep, playing over these short circuit metaphors, right?
And let's tie it back to energy too. Also like using this exercise as a way to kind of lead students to realize that a figure like Thanos, or a real world like an El Paso shooter, Buffalo shooter, Christchurch shooter, claiming to protect resources for an elect few, right? Let's lead the students to the realization that these folks actually aren't advocating any kind of real environmentalist solutions. I think it was Andreas Malm who sort of wrote that, like, the idea of immigration restriction as a way of solving the climate crisis is just another iteration of climate change denial. Because what you're doing is you're just papering over the fact that the nations that you don't want immigrants coming into are the ones that are driving the climate crisis to begin with, right? So when you look at figures like the El Paso shooter, the Buffalo shooter, they're not doing any meaningful environmental work. What they're saying is, I want to protect me and other straight white people and our right to keep consuming at the rate we're consuming.
And we should say, too, to clarify, when we say straight, me and other straight white people, like, whiteness is not a...
Sure. No.
Is not... Whiteness, too, is a fiction, right? It's a set of property relations that any phenotype can fit into. And so, especially now when we have this kind of explosion of multicultural white supremacy, that it's not a... Yeah, it's not a... There's no biological fact.
But for somebody
those,
like the El Paso
kind
shooter,
of
there is,
subjectivities.
which is largely the point, right?
Yeah. And I think too the one of the debates, or maybe it's not even a debate, but like maybe points of divergence in the scholarship is whether to take their environmental claims seriously on these kind of contemporary eco-fascist mass murders, whether they're appropriately or like whether we should believe them as environmentalists or not. And I think Alex and I both are not terribly interested in that question. I'm glad people are paying attention to that question, but I kind of think the stakes of not taking them seriously are much higher than the stakes of taking them seriously. Yeah. So,
and I think it's also just worth mentioning that however horrific their solutions and the world making structures that inform those solutions. Coming from a legitimate place of anxiety that is shared by many of our students, as evidenced by numerous scholars in the humanities and social sciences pointing out that large swaths of their classrooms, are so freaked out about climate change that they're saying things like, I would accept a dictator if it meant the dictator solving this problem, or we do need to call the world's population. Of course, they're never talking about themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Which is why it's important to take seriously those moments. It's a real anxiety, but let's think about the structures of thought that have formed around those anxieties or that feed into them.
Yeah, I feel like one of the most useful things lately that I've been doing in the classroom, and this is a little bit of a riff on Mary Ennis Hegler and a couple other, but is one recognizing that eco-fascists, I think one of the things you were saying is that contemporary far-right eco-fascists think that they are taking climate action, right? Their actions are climate action. May not be the kind of climate action we want to see, but that's, they think that they're doing something, right? Thanos says, I'm the only person who was tough enough to do this.
It's climate action that's consistent with what Amitav Ghosh says about, for the quote-unquote developed nation states, climate action is an increased security apparatus because climate change is a threat multiplier, quote-unquote, right? And that's where... So it's climate action.
Which is a perfect example of the ways that eco-fascist logic is then self-reinforcing. It's built into the kind of horizon of possibility for the state to respond. And the other thing that I found really useful in the classroom, and it maybe seems kind of obvious or something, but I start all my classes saying, look, none of us asked to be born into this situation, and we are all here. We are all here, and we have to live. Right? And so, that, I think, giving us all permission to acknowledge the messiness of our embeddedness and the messiness and divergence of our responsibilities is a really powerful, I found, in the classroom. Obviously, it depends on teaching persona and class population, but that, I think, is something that in our group we've returned to so many times, is just anytime we're fantasizing about a single unassailable action that is purity politics, and that is part of the common sense of fascism, right? The messy situations mean that we are going to be navigating them messily, right? And calling each other, in, but not out, or yeah.
How am I usually have a clock, so how am I doing? Okay. Good. I want to pivot a little bit, hopefully as a kind of precursor to then having the rest of the group ask questions. But Alex's book is organized around what he calls threshold objects. And some examples of those are tools and food and land, and drugs is an interesting one. And
that's actually where the book started.
Yeah.
The drug.
And contagion is another, which I understand was something that you sort of worked up in consultation with April to some extent. I thought the question I want to ask, first of all, is how do you theorize threshold objects, which I think is a very interesting category. And then for both of you, how do we take that idea of threshold objects as the point from which eco-fascist narratives are oriented, and apply it to energy, right? Whether energy as a kind of broad category or specific iterations of energy, oil, coal, solar, wind, whatever, right? So if we're thinking about, okay, how do we take everyday ecofascism and make it apply to energy studies as a kind of threshold object? What are some of the kind of narratives or texts or ideas that you would bring to that?
Sure. Well, I'll start, and then April, you can begin answering the second half of the question. So the threshold object idea, you mentioned one of them was drugs. That's actually where I started. I was really fascinated. When I was still in graduate school, I wrote an article completely unrelated to my dissertation, because there was a piece published in the New Yorker about the McKenna brothers, Terrence and Dennis McKenna, who were these proselytizers of ayahuasca. And in the mid-2010s, ayahuasca was experiencing this big boom in popularity again. And I was really interested in these questions of appeals to the dissolution of the self in our culture, especially in environmentalist culture. And so I started writing this piece about how organic hallucinogens like ayahuasca, psilocybin, peyote, etc., facilitate this sense of oneness with the world around you, chemically, and how that chemical reaction works, but also, more importantly, how people were interpreting it and talking about it and framing it, because it really, I really started to notice the extent to which, online, gurus on, Vice Media and, places like that were really kind of framing it as sort of if you've experienced this oneness with the earth, you're enlightened. You've accessed this, condition, this, originary state of psychic nature. And having accessed that condition renders you sort of innocent of the environmental damages, wreaked by humankind, right? And that it renders you worthy of living and survival, because you really see the earth as it really is. That was really interesting to me. And that kind of led me to the threshold object idea, and it was only after I was thinking about that I had a similar April moment where I was kind of oh, what I'm talking about is ecofascism. And so earlier I said that if we think about ecofascism like a genre, it's something that we can look at in many places and point to it and say that's ecofascism in New Zealand or Norway or this, that, and the other. But every nation has its particular preoccupations and cultural traditions, so the actual kind of peopling of the story within the genre is going to change by necessity. So my argument in that book is essentially that in the US, eco-fascist storytelling revolves around the consumption of particular objects, and that traces back to the original consumption of objects in the US settler state land, right? Land being, as Roxanne Ortiz puts it, land was the first commodity, right? And I think about consumption, there was a lot of wrestling over that word between me and the peer reviewers of the book, and I think rightfully so, because when I say consumption, it's, I'm not trying to reduce land to a commodity either, but I'm more interested in how are other people talking about it, right? Are other people looking at it as something to be consumed? And consumption, not just in terms of economic value, but consumption in terms of incorporating something into oneself and rendering it a matter of one's identity, which is something I came to through thinking a lot about food, about how food really disturbs boundaries between inside and outside. Food is really deeply tied to cultural identities, and also it's very much about, it is, if it's not a purity politics, it's so often tied to an authenticity politics, right? So for me, it was thinking about how the consumption of landscapes is really central to narratives of entitlement to land and national belonging, and I was thinking about that across the 19th and 20th centuries. But then I was my kind of background as an Americanist is really fixated on the 60s and 70s, and I was really thinking about the whole Earth catalog, and I was thinking about Ernest Callenbach's Ecotopia, and about how the whole Earth catalog was all about tools, back to the land movement, DIY, in a lot of really, really productive and generative ways. But at the same time, I was fascinated by the fact that something similar appears in Ernest Callenbach's novel, all the characters. For those who aren't familiar with the novel, it's a work of speculative fiction where there's a kind of a splinter state. It secedes from the U.S. It's basically Cascadia. But they're all like, what I was really fascinated by in the book is that they're like, all the characters and the author himself in interviews is like, they're all seceding from capitalism. And yet, like, in like privatization, and yet the funny thing about it is this whole society is structured around these really like institutionalized like shopping centers, like, but they're all like populated by like the tools, you know, like the sort of like whole earth style tools. And I was also fascinated by the fact that Kallenbach has been hailed, like that novel has been used as like a handbook for Back to the Landers and sustainability folks since it was published. It's also hugely popular like among white nationalist groups in the Pacific Northwest. And I'm like, that's a really fascinating kind of resonance. But I was really interested in that book and thinking about how like this like relationship to tools in this book for this writer and for a lot of people in his orbit, it wasn't just like a be self-sufficient, you know, create an inclusive community and, you know, in a direct democracy sort of situation as was so popular at the time. It was very much a rehearsal of, I have purchased these tools and I am using them to cultivate land in a way that makes me an organic product of that land. There was this kind of logic in the way the tools were being used. So the consumption of these tools in this alternative marketplace was itself an avenue toward expressing an organic belonging on the land that rendered one both innocent of any damage done to the land and also like a privileged claimant to it. And in the novel, you kind of see the way this shakes out, like the society in Ecotopia is like racially segregated, like, and it has everything to do with the way people use tools, you know. And then food functions similarly, like I specifically think about Appalachia and how for some writers in Appalachia, certain quote-unquote hardy mountain foods render one closer to the earth and a privileged dweller in this like region that is often treated as this repository of revolutionary era Americanness. And in all of these cases, these are like rhetorical situations in which one is arguing that by consuming a certain object, they have rendered themselves innocent of ecological destruction. They have an organic connection to land. Other people do not. And the whole thing just ultimately serves to kind of efface problems of like access, for example, matters of environmental injustice, and this, that, and the other. I've been going on for a while. The last thing you had asked me was about the term threshold object. One of the ways I describe it is like, so it's like crossing a threshold, but I think of it, the way these writers and speakers think of it is it's like the antediluvian apple in reverse. It's like you eat the apple and you return to Eden, and that's the threshold they're crossing. But everybody else is, you know, it's like not for nothing, not coincidentally, it has a lot of resonance with like rapture discourse, you know, like this select few who are able and canny enough to consume the right things in the right ways are being raptured into this Eden while the sinners are left toiling despite the structural conditions that have kind of shaped them.
I love that definition, and it's a perfect kind of definition maybe then to segue to our 19th century American as thinking about like, it's probably pretty hard to think of oil as the antediluvian apple today.
Right.
But it's not hard at all to think of how the drillers of the 1870s or 1880s were thinking of it that way. So how do you think of the eco-fascist narratives around energy as performing this kind of threshold object passage?
Oof, I think that's a complicated formulation of that question. So forgive me if I answer a more simple version of it. But I think if we were to boil down to like an ethos or a philosophy of what Alex was talking about is that like that dream of something for nothing, right? That, you know, is a kind of a through line. And it feels very powerful to me that when you look at the energy systems accompanying the Industrial Revolution, they map so, not like date, time neat, but era-wise, pretty neat into the changing of racial categories, right? So if we just think in like a kind of general terms about this dream of, endless power for free, and also the subconscious or barely subconscious acknowledgement that it is actually enabling power over, or power over other folks enables the extraction that then we can then re-narrativize as free. That structure is has been unchanged since the earliest colonial narratives that we have.
Well, if you think about fascism as a narrative, right, if you boil it down to its simplest parts, it's like a nation that has been declining due to its supposedly nefarious interests, needs to be reborn through violence, against two people who are already disenfranchised in some way, right? And that is kind of the simplest form. Ecofascism, same thing, except it's an ecological community conceived as having declined, right? So when I think about oil in particular, or coal, right, I'm not in thinking of them in terms of threshold objects. I'm not necessarily thinking of that in terms of like an eco-fascist appeal. I mean, it could be just fascist, right? I mean, that's fossil fascism, as Malm calls it, right? And like what April was just describing about the late 19th century, I mean, part of making America great again apparently means consuming more coal, right? It's just as true today.
But
returning to that eating that antediluvian apple, it might not have as much to do in that particular discourse with a declining ecological community, but it certainly does with a perceived declining national one.
Yeah, and I think this is maybe preaching to the choir here, but this is why both Alex and I focus on genre and in really different ways. I mean, he's talking about a political genre. I'm very much invested in like literal genre and the way that it enables the eco-fascist logic to slip through as a kind of common sense, because the generic frame is a kind of common sense, and so all these things get trucked in. But I think
the novel.
Like the novel, or the Gothic, or of course the apocalypse, right? Like as you mentioned, like evergreen. But I also think your point about the kind of whiplash return to coal that we have just witnessed really testifies to the flexibility of the object, right? Like it doesn't actually matter. What matters is the power relations embedded in that. That fuel source or energy source, that it is, exhaustion for some and
that's
life
a great
for
way
a
to
few.
put it. Yeah, and that's kind of, I guess, what I would say about the book too. Like the objects matter in terms of the particularities of a given moment, but zooming out, the object itself is rather arbitrary. What matters is the story that's being built around that object.
I want to pass it on to questions, but I will just acknowledge I've just finished a 20-some episode arc about the Gilded Age, and the Gilded Age begins with a purchase of land by a paterfamilias figure who claims a kind of vision of the future, and part of that vision of the future is steam power and trains, and he believes that across this land that he has just purchased there is coal and oil that will make for a verdant future for his kids, but there is no capacity to commoditize them yet, right? That it depends upon this speculative narrative around what's going to happen with these technologies that are in their nascent phase that will then turn this particular cross-section of the Middle South that is torn between the industrial North and the plantation South, right? That it will transform it into a kind of Eden. And so, yeah, I think that's why I find this this notion of the threshold object in Twain's work, right, is sometimes very much the energy products.
And quite literally a
Yeah.
boundary, right? Yeah.
But I would add, just to kind of cap that off, is like, again, I very strongly think that like we need to understand that is a particularly American iteration
Yeah.
of fascism. That's like that's the discursive process of fascism in a U.S. context, because commodification has been such an important part of the political and
It's the
artistic
only
and
way to
literary
dream.
tradition. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. Yes. Thank you.